All right. Hey, all right. So let me share my screen and we'll get rolling. So, guys, we've been talking about yep, we've been talking about obviously observational research, right? And we've spent a couple lectures, talking about the fundamentals of observational research, right? And how that has really kind of become more common, right? Um, Particularly within the research arena itself. I want to make sure though, um, before I start yakking, I want to make sure that you guys can see. Um, all right, can you guys see the PowerPoint? Yep,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, so guys, we're going to get into qualitative research today. Okay, so much like our observational research that we talked about. Um, Qualitative research is also performed within the natural environment, but very much so the methodology is different, right? So the biggest thing, right, with qualitative research is that what we have actually started to discover, right, over time, is that many experimental studies, right, and also a lot of observational studies don't adequately capture um, certain problems, right, certain perspectives. And so the qualitative research has been something that's been developing for approximately the past 20 years or so, right? That seeks to essentially evaluate people's lived experiences and their behaviors, right? And this can be anything from perceptions, of events to anything from trying to essentially explore a construct or a concept, right? And so here's the thing: very often when we are attempting to kind of define something, that's a little bit more fluid, like intelligence and or expertise, right? Something like that, and or try to understand a problem in depth, that's not well understood oftentimes. Initially, these things tend to not lend themselves well to quantitative methods. So, in order to develop a theoretical base for a problem so that it can be measured, sometimes we need to start off, right? Uh, Understanding the themes behind the problem, understanding the main points and concerns, right? And that's one way that we utilize qualitative research. So, obviously, um, qualitative methods, that's something that obviously increasing in popularity, particularly in things like in fields like psychology, sociology, and even in healthcare to a certain extent, right? And so, ultimately, the goal, though, with qualitative methods is to essentially attempt to develop the data right into themes. So here's an example. Okay, this is actually a qualitative study that I conducted a long time ago, but if anybody has ever had a concussion, right, and or has had like any sort of traumatic brain injury like that, you know, oftentimes when you see a healthcare provider, right, we'll sit you down and we'll ask you questions. You know, can you, I'm gonna read off a list of symptoms to you, and I want you to rate them on a scale of 0 to 6. Do you have a headache today? Yeah, is it yes or no? And if you do, then you'll give it a score, right? From 0 being nothing to 6, right, being severe, right, worst ever, right, and then so on and so forth for all of the 22 symptoms um, that we've identified, okay, as a part of concussion. Um, Now, conversely, though, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Although that information is useful, right, in categorizing and you know understanding severity, right, and in collecting that quantitative data, the one thing that doesn't do for me is it doesn't actually tell me how is this affecting somebody on the daily, right? How is this impacting their life? And so ultimately, when that person sits down in front of a healthcare provider, the first question that they're asked, right, is tell me what's going on. Tell me what happened here. And ultimately what results what results from that question, excuse me, is a story. right, is the person's own lived experience or story, right, with regard to that injury. And so uh, there are things that you know lived experiences, all these types of things and nuances, right, that cannot be adequately measured within any type of quantitative design, right? So it's important for us to essentially utilize qualitative research to not only understand, right, these lived experiences, but also to develop, right, a way to deal with nuance and detail, right? Extremely important. So obviously, qualitative researchers do sometimes obviously use quantitative things like numbers to describe participants and data at times. But the bottom line is that qualitative research relies heavily on text, right, from interviews, and even observations. So even field observations, and we'll talk about that next week. Excuse me. So here's the deal, right? Qualitative research is very much has a human focus to it. So qualitative methods, right, as we've been talking about, focus on lived experiences, behaviors, and perceptions, right? And ultimately, if we're seeking to understand, okay, how someone assigns meaning to something, to an event, to life, and or any some type of social construct, right, we would typically utilize qualitative research to understand that. All right. Um, Now, unlike our quantitative methods, where we are looking at, obviously, uh, mean values with standard deviation, right, and assessing differences between groups, unlike numbers being data and frequency being data, right, uh, the data is now text. It's words. Right, so transcripts from interviews or and notes from field observations, so on and so forth, are used as data. Right, ultimately, you'll hear personal descriptions of events or concepts, right, um, that are analyzed, right, among groups of people. And then typically what we do is we will analyze those for themes, and then we will check them for accuracy and consistency, right, um, by a research team with experience in qualitative inquiry, right? Like our observational research, okay, qualitative research takes place in a natural environment, right, uh, with natural interaction, right, and behavior as the variable of interest. That's what we're observing, right? And so obviously when we choose sorry, when we choose qualitative research, right, many times, just like with our quantitative research, we're attempting to identify a gap in knowledge. Okay, within a review of literature, or as in quantitative methods, or we may feel, right, that based on our review of a given topic, that maybe there's a certain nuance, right, within a condition or within an environment that is not actually adequately appreciated or described by a quantitative study. So we may make the decision to perform a qualitative study to further explore that nuance or that detail. Sorry. So here's the thing, right? Oh my God. Sorry, my dog is being a pain. Um, so ultimately, right, with the with qualitative research, we do take a systematic approach, right? And so ultimately, we try to identify our question, right, based on a gap in knowledge, but it is also inherently flexible, because the data that results from interviews and from field observations may take us in an entirely different direction, right? It may actually lead to answers to our question that we were not expecting, right? Generally, also in qualitative research, we're able to deal more readily with smaller sample sizes because, right, ultimately what we are looking for is consistency in data and themes, right? And we're going to learn a term next week called data saturation. Okay, um, and that is really kind of the kicker. Okay, we are looking for our data to become saturated or collect similar or same responses from our participants throughout, right, and identify similar themes. So, what are the goals, though? What are we trying to do with qualitative inquiry, with qualitative research? We are trying to provide a description that is rich, right? Ultimately, trying to provide data, provide those types of things that are ultimately going to provide us with a lot of detail, right? And a lot of highly detailed, highly impactful information, but also data that results in patterns, right? And here's the thing: as we have this rich data that builds patterns, and we see those patterns emerge over and over and over again, then as those data patterns start to emerge, then that actually results over time in the building of a theory. Okay, so now if we've been able to build a theory utilizing qualitative research, then perhaps we can actually take that theory and then start to develop a quantitative structure to measure it, because now we understand the content of that theory, right? And so qualitative research is a highly useful method of inquiry for pieces of knowledge that are new. Okay, um, so you guys, excuse me for just a minute. For just 1 second. I'm so sorry. I've got to let my dog out. 1 second. All right, you guys, so sorry. He is a grumpy old man. This dog is killing me. Okay. All right. Here's the thing, guys. So qualitative methodology, right? Is qualitative methodology science? So there is actually still disagreement within the scientific community as to whether or not qualitative inquiry meets the rigor of the scientific method, right? So ultimately, despite that level of disagreement, people are using qualitative methods more and more in a lot of journals, right? Whether it's an open access journal or whether it's tightly peer reviewed, right? And so obviously, as we've talked about, quantitative methodologies have limits, right? And they can't define things that ultimately cannot be measured objectively, right? So another example, right? Here's a question. Okay, what makes someone an expert at something, right? So ultimately, people would often say, well, if someone has been doing something for X number of thousands of hours, or if they have this many years of experience, right, within a given field, we would expect them to be an expert, right? But I'm sure all of you, and maybe at some point in your lives, have had an experience, maybe maybe with a healthcare provider or someone who has a ton of experience, but they're still not very good at their job. They kind of suck at it, right? And so ultimately, right, that that strict measure, that quantitative measure, right, of expertise doesn't necessarily define what it means to be an expert, right? Because it's ultimately kind of it's a tight and limited definition of expertise, right? And one that is not necessarily consistent. Conversely, right, if we were to take you know 20, 30 people, okay, within medicine, and ask them, okay, what makes a healthcare provider an expert? What makes someone an expert, right? you may actually get through those interview questions a number of different responses, but ultimately because you are identifying, right, and you're talking with so many people, ultimately what will happen is you will start to hear similar things be said, right, by by those people, right, and then you will start to identify those similar themes and experiences of what makes someone an expert, right. So ultimately though, excuse me, within qualitative methodology, we use structured approaches that are based on the goals of a study, right? And based on the goals of a study, we select a specific methodological approach to our qualitative study. And that structured approach to qualitative research is called a tradition. So those are traditions. We're going to talk about a few of those, the main ones, basically. Okay. So we're going to talk about essentially three main ones, but ultimately these traditions inform the process, right, of how we collect our data, right, how we achieve data saturation, right, and how we actually ensure trustworthiness of data when we're analyzing the data, right. um, and so this is actually the process of data that's actually generic to qualitative research itself, right. um, and ultimately, right, um, we will ultimately develop specific themes, okay, within qualitative traditions, based on the tradition that we use. So the three main traditions that we're going to discuss are ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. Okay, so the first one, okay, ethnography. So ethnography. So this is an approach to qualitative research that actually finds its roots in anthropology, right? So the definition of ethnography is essentially attempting to understand how groups create and negotiate meaning, right? How relationships develop between people, and how people create and institute policy. So when we talk about ethnographic research within qualitative studies, right, we're specifically interested in the structure of cultures and hierarchies, right? So punishment reward, okay, does a clear hierarchy exist, right? And are there any things or rituals or practices that arise from the formation of that culture, right? And so, for example, have an example on the next slide. Jane Goodall, she was an anthropologist and an environmentalist, and she actually spent a lot of time, obviously, with gorillas, right? Particularly in gorilla colonies and communities. And she was actually able to use an ethnographic approach to describe hierarchies within those communities. Okay, so here's Jane chilling. She's chilling with a chimpanzee. Looks like a great day. It's very fascinated with her hair. So she spent time in this colony, right, of primates to essentially attempt to discover what were the communal hierarchies there, right? And she essentially was able to describe those, right, in regards to the dominance as far as even in colonies of gorillas, silverback gorillas, those types of things, and how that all related to community structure. And what's even really actually even fascinating about that is she actually went back to the same communities uh, even years, decades after her initial investigation, and this in the same communities of primates, she was actually still recognized, which is pretty cool. So, okay, when we talk about ethnographic methods, though, right? The bottom line is that a lot of our ethnographic methods are going to include observation. Okay, there's going to be, we'll talk about a component of qualitative research known as field observations. So these field observations are going to essentially allow us to sit back and observe behavior, right? And we might actually combine at times those observations with census data and or different data, uh, you know, from the population that we're studying. So generally speaking, we will write down those observations in field notes, right? And we'll start off with general observations and then actually kind of formulate more specific observations over time. But once again, the goal is to identify themes, right? To identify patterns and themes um, inside of those observations. Okay. The next one that we'll talk about is phenomenology. Okay. Phenomenology obviously is connected to philosophy, right? As a discipline, and the phenomenological research is interested in how participants experience a specific phenomenon. Okay. And so what we're attempting to really do here is draw out meaning, right? And interpretation from lived experiences. Um, So ultimately, phenomenological methodology is going to use a practice called bracketing, right, to identify personal biases prior to conducting the study, right, and ultimately to control for those uh, in the data collection process, right. And so ultimately, what we will often do is we will actually identify, potential perceived biases with regard to a certain subject, and we will actually um, note, right, as we're analyzing our data, whether or not the data interpretation could be uh, affected by a certain bias, and that's something actually that the research team will uh, keep in mind as they continue to analyze the data, right. All right, next one, right, and this we're actually almost done here. So grounded theory, okay. Grounded theory, obviously, the approach here, right, is we're essentially, as trying to uh, develop a theory as to why something is the way it is, right, to explore events or constructs within a social context and describe maybe why they're happening or why things are the way they are. So obviously grounded theory, right. So the following steps is, is we're going to first identify and compare information or incidents within a specific environment. And then we're going to develop categories and subcategories, right? And then ultimately, as we develop categories and subcategories, okay, and we achieve that data saturation where things start to look and sound the same, right? Then we'll actually start to develop components of a theory. Okay. Then ultimately, we attempt to, through our data analysis process and discussion, we attempt to explain that theory. So the bottom line is that with grounded theory, okay, if your study does not result in a theory, right, then you are not exactly conducting a study uh, that is using a grounded theory approach, right? So uh, so these are the top three methodologies, right, that we're going to see in qualitative research. So we have phenomenology, ethnography, and grounded theory. Um, so what we're going to do over the coming days is we're going to learn a little bit more about qualitative inquiry, particularly subject selection, excuse me, uh, recruitment and data analysis, right? And so we will actually spend a little bit more time talking about that, and generally just how the theory itself is, or how the approach itself is utilized, and how that all comes together to essentially conduct an actual study, right? So, um, but believe it or not, guys, that is it for today. Okay, short class as is our custom on Fridays. I hope that you guys are doing okay. I hope that you have a great weekend. This is actually already posted on Moodle for those of you that have not that are curious about that, but it's already there. So that is it for today, and I will see you guys on Monday. All right. That was
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.